Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the universe preparing us for who we're meant to become. In the unforgiving heartland, where fortunes are built on grit and destroyed by greed, a new legend is about to be told. Before the harvest begins, offer your tribute. If you believe in the triumph of the underdog, show your support with a like. Join our community by subscribing so you won't miss the secrets buried in the land. Now prepare yourselves. The air in the Las Vegas Convention Center was a manufactured climate of success, surgically chilled to a precise 68 degrees and smelling faintly of ozone, new carpet, and the collective cologne of 1,000 aspiring billionaires. It was a suffocating aura of ambition and predatory finance, a world far removed from the honest earth. Elias Thorne felt the hum of it not in his ears, but in the soles of his worn leather boots, a low-frequency vibration that resonated deep within his weary bones. It was the same frantic, almost desperate energy a combine harvester makes when its engine is running just a little too lean, threatening to seize up and burn itself out. Here, amidst the gleaming chrome and sharp-edged rhetoric, Elias was a ghost, a specter of the forgotten past. Dressed in faded blue coveralls, he pushed a wide-mouthed trash receptacle through a relentless current of tailored Italian suits and razor-sharp blazers, his presence as ephemeral as the dust motes dancing in the artificial light. He was background scenery, a disposable cog in the vast, polished machinery that made the spectacle possible but was never meant to be seen. His purpose was to erase spills, collect discarded brochures printed on paper heavier than currency, and most crucially, to remain invisible. And he was exquisitely good at it. For 20 years, since the day he had consciously walked away from the cacophony of corporate noise and the sterile precision of schematics, he had perfected the art of being utterly overlooked. He sought the quiet oblivion, the reprieve from a world that had betrayed its own heart. There are truths that only reveal themselves when everything we know falls apart, and Elias had watched his own world crumble long ago, finding a strange, quiet truth in the profound silence that followed. This deliberate anonymity was his sanctuary, his penance, and his shield. His thoughts drifted, a familiar ache blooming in his chest. His own humble farm, a century-old legacy of his family, stood teetering on the precipice of ruin, a silent sentinel against the encroachment of a soulless future. The janitorial gig in this temple of technological hubris was a necessary humiliation, a meager lifeline to patch a leaky barn roof, to keep the ghosts of his ancestors from whispering too loudly in the Nebraska wind. The weight of generations pressed down on him, the unspoken promise he had made to his dying father that he would never let the land go. It was a debt not just financial, but spiritual, etched into his very being. Today, however, as the spotlights intensified on the main stage, another man's world was about to unravel, and the entire globe, via live feed, had a front-row seat to the spectacle. On that elevated platform, under a constellation of blinding spotlights that bleached all genuine color from the world, Julian Sterling, the self-proclaimed visionary CEO of Sterling Dynamics, was preparing to press a single button, a gesture he believed would change the face of agriculture forever. Or so his monumental hubris led him to believe. Elias paused his slow, methodical route, leaning his worn body against his cart near a cold concrete support pillar, a silent observer in a world of manufactured grandeur. He wasn't interested in the dizzying complexity of quantum computing, the seamless precision of satellite-guided navigation, or the audacious promise of AI-driven crop analysis. His senses, honed by decades of communion with true machinery, bypassed the superficial glamour. He was listening for something far deeper, far more fundamental, the faint, authentic heartbeat of the machine. The monstrosity sat center stage like a dormant, obsidian god of the harvest. It was christened the Titanex, a behemoth of gleaming, obsidian-black composite and polished chrome, its lines more akin to a stealth bomber than any piece of farm equipment Elias had ever laid eyes on. It represented a $5 million promise of a future without farmers, a chilling vision of a world where food production was reduced to a clean, cold, infallible algorithm. Julian Sterling, a modern-day messiah of profit and progress, stood beside it, resplendent in a $1,000 t-shirt beneath a razor-sharp blazer. His teeth were impossibly white against his spray-tanned skin, his voice artificially amplified, a booming, confident baritone that filled every corner of the vast hall, echoing off the polished surfaces and the expectant faces. He was a performance, a carefully curated illusion of unassailable success. "The age of guesswork is over," Sterling proclaimed, his arms spread wide in a gesture of almost divine authority, encompassing the entire assembly in his sweeping vision. "The age of sweat and struggle, the archaic reliance on instinct and intuition, is a relic of the past. We are not just harvesting crops, we are harvesting data. We are not just turning soil, we are turning the very paradigm of human sustenance on its head." His words were a siren song to the gathered elite, a promise of boundless wealth and untroubled dominion. The crowd, a meticulously curated mix of venture capitalists, tech journalists, and agricultural conglomerate executives, roared their approval, a hungry, collective sound that vibrated through the floor. Their faces were upturned, bathed in the cool blue and stark white light of the stage, reflecting the raw hunger for disruption, for the next transformative big thing that would make them impossibly richer, further detached from the realities of the land. They were sharks, sensing blood in the water, a new frontier of exploitation. "The Titanex is not merely a machine," Sterling continued, his voice dropping now to a conspiratorial, dramatic whisper, a calculated intimacy designed to enthrall. "It is a statement that the future is not just coming, it is here, and it starts now." The words hung heavy with manufactured anticipation. He turned with a precisely choreographed flourish, his back to the audience, and placed a manicured thumb, a thumb that had likely never touched genuine soil, on a single glowing red button on the machine's control panel. 100 cameras flashed simultaneously, capturing what was intended to be an historic, triumphant moment. The live feed broadcast the iconic image to millions around the globe, etching it into the collective consciousness of a hungry world. Sterling pressed the button, and nothing happened. A profound electronic silence, cold and absolute, descended upon the vast hall. It was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical entity, a vacuum that sucked the air from the room. The only lingering auditory trace was the faint, monotonous hum of the convention center's HVAC system, a stark counterpoint to the monumental failure. Sterling's triumphant, practiced smile faltered, a desperate twitch at the corners of his lips. A bead of sweat traced a path down his spray-tanned temple. He pressed the button again, harder this time, a flicker of raw, undisguised panic flashing in his eyes, brief as a lightning strike. Still nothing. The silence was no longer passive. It became an active, crushing weight, a hammer blow of unadulterated failure. It was the visceral sound of $500 million in research and development evaporating into thin air, a fortune vanishing into the ether of non-existence. It was the terrifying, precipitous sound of a stock price about to nosedive off a cliff, dragging careers and empires with it. The crowd's enthusiastic murmur died, replaced by an awkward, contagious coughing, a nervous chorus of discomfort. Whispers, sharp and laced with burgeoning doubt, started to ripple through the front rows like a spreading contagion. Sterling's face, projected onto the massive screens flanking the stage, cycled through a Rolodex of primal emotions in mere seconds. The confident showman, the confused technician, and finally the cornered, desperate animal, sensing its own impending doom. He spun around, his smile now a brittle, painted-on mask, a grotesque parody of his earlier assuredness. A minor software glitch, ladies and gentlemen, he stammered, his voice a few octaves too high, betraying the tremor of raw fear that had seized him. The quantum processors are simply recalibrating for the atmospheric density in the hall. A simple reboot is all that's needed, a momentary pause before the future fully awakens. He tried to inject a note of calm, but it was hollow, unconvincing. He gestured frantically to a huddle of engineers in matching black polo shirts, a uniform of professional servitude, who were now swarming the stage, their faces pale with terror, their eyes wide with panic. They descended on the Titanex with tablets and diagnostic tools, their fingers flying across glass screens in a desperate, futile ballet, their voices a frantic buzz of incomprehensible jargon and panicked excuses. The live feed cameras, like vultures circling carrion, zoomed in on their desperate faces, broadcasting the unvarnished failure in excruciating high definition to millions across the globe. From his distant pillar, a sentinel of old wisdom, Elias Thorne watched, unmoving, his gaze fixed. He wasn't looking at the frantic engineers or their useless tablets, which screamed 1,000 data points but offered no answers. He was looking at the engine block itself, barely visible behind a sleek composite panel, and he was listening. And in the oppressive, agonizing silence of Sterling's collapse, he could hear it. A tiny, discordant note in the symphony of the machine, a whisper only he seemed capable of perceiving. A single, critical component, starved. It was a silence that spoke volumes of fundamental design flaws, of a disconnect between the intellect that conceived and the intuition that built. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the unseen clock a hammer blow against Sterling's crumbling edifice of confidence. The engineer's frantic ballet of incompetence yielded nothing. The Titanex remained as lifeless as a monument to failed ambition, a cold, mocking testament to digital hubris. The initial awkwardness in the crowd had curdled into something far more dangerous and humiliating for Julian Sterling. Amusement. A few titters could be heard, then outright chuckles, growing bolder, sharper, like the distant braying of jackals sensing weakness. The tech messiah, the proclaimed harbinger of a new era, had been struck down by his own creation, impaled on the altar of his own arrogance. Sterling's face was a mask of crimson fury, a deep, furious blush spreading across his carefully crafted tan. His meticulously constructed image, forged over years of ruthless ambition and public relations, was shattering, piece by agonizing piece, under the merciless glare of the very spotlights he had so desperately courted. He began to pace the stage like a caged predator, a man stripped bare of his illusions, his voice no longer booming but a venomous hiss directed at his lead engineer, broadcasting his unraveling to the world through his still-live microphone. What do you mean you don't know? You have a doctorate from MIT. You have a team of 60 highly paid specialists. Find the problem and fix it, you imbeciles. He snarled, the words dripping with raw venom, forgetting in his panic that his microphone was still live, broadcasting his unbridled meltdown to millions around the world. He was losing control, the one thing a man like him, whose entire empire was built on a facade of unshakable command, could never afford to do. The pressure building inside his skull was immense, a visceral ache, and he desperately needed a target, a release valve for the escalating humiliation. His wild, panicked eyes scanned the periphery of the vast hall, darting across the faces of 1,000 potential critics, and landed with predatory precision on the one person in the entire assembly who utterly, irreconcilably, did not belong: Elias Thorne. The old man in the faded coveralls was still by his concrete pillar, but he had moved slightly, a subtle shift that belied his previous invisibility. He was leaning forward, his gaze fixed on the inert Titanex, his head cocked at a slight, almost imperceptible angle. It wasn't the vacant stare of a bored janitor, a man lost in the mundane. It was the focused, intense scrutiny of a physician examining a critical patient, a mechanic diagnosing the terminal groan of a failing engine. There was a quiet knowing in his posture, a deep, unshakable confidence that, to Sterling's frayed nerves, felt like an unbearable judgment, an ancient wisdom mocking modern folly. In that precise, agonizing moment, Elias Thorne ceased to be invisible. He became the embodiment of everything Julian Sterling despised, everything his digital revolution was designed to render obsolete. The old world, the grease-stained analog past, the stubbornly visceral understanding of the earth and its machines. He was a perfect target, a sacrificial lamb for Sterling's public redemption. Sterling strode to the very edge of the stage, his finger trembling with a mixture of rage and terror as he pointed accusingly at Elias. The camera operators, sensing drama, sensing blood, swiveled their lenses to follow his gesture, transforming the janitor into an unwilling focal point. "You with the mop," Sterling's voice boomed, dripping with unadulterated scorn, an acidic insult hurled across the chasm of their social divide. "What in God's name are you looking at over there, you insignificant old fool?" Elias Thorne straightened up slowly, with a deliberate, unhurried grace that defied the frantic energy on stage. His calm, almost serene demeanor was a stark, infuriating contrast to Sterling's unraveling hysteria. He didn't say anything. He didn't flinch. He just met the CEO's enraged glare with eyes that held the quiet patience of granite, an ancient, unblinking challenge. The spotlight, a cruel, indifferent eye, swung over, catching Elias squarely in its blinding beam. The sudden, unwelcome attention made him squint, a visceral reaction to the artificial glare. He was no longer a shadow, no longer background noise. He was a spectacle, an unexpected act in a corporate tragedy. The crowd, desperate for a distraction from the excruciating failure unfolding on stage, turned as one, their collective gaze now fixed on the old man in the work clothes, a fresh, unsuspecting victim. "You find this funny," Sterling spat, his voice laced with venom, projecting all his humiliation, all his self-loathing, onto the quiet figure below. "You actually think you know something my team of quantum engineers, my MIT doctorates, my 60 specialists don't. Let me guess, old man, you think it needs a new fan belt. Perhaps some duct tape and a prayer." He sneered, his words a performance of contempt designed to regain control. A wave of cruel, derisive laughter rolled through the audience, a collective sigh of relief as the pressure was redirected. They were laughing with Sterling now, not at him. The humiliation had been successfully transferred. Elias was the new joke, the convenient scapegoat, the embodiment of everything they considered beneath them. The bloodlust was sated for a moment. Think you can fix a multi-threaded, quantum-coded, neural-networked engine, a $5 million marvel of modern engineering, with a mop, old man? Sterling pressed on, feeding off the crowd's raw energy, his arrogance battered but not broken, reasserting itself like a bruised predator. He was back in control, orchestrating the public shaming of a nobody, restoring the fragile illusion of his power. Elias' eyes never left Sterling's. They were calm, clear, and ancient, reflecting a wisdom that spanned generations of work and understanding. They held no fear, no anger, only a deep, weary patience, a profound understanding of the man before him. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a gesture of quiet, unyielding denial. It was that quiet denial, that serene refusal to engage in the charade, that broke something fundamental in Julian Sterling. It wasn't just disagreement, it was defiance. And to a man like Sterling, defiance from a perceived subordinate, from a nobody, was intolerable. It was a challenge to his very existence, and it required a response, a decisive, crushing blow. The laughter of the crowd, a raucous, intoxicating drug, momentarily numbed Julian Sterling to the burning sting of his colossal failure. He felt a surge of his old confidence return, a twisted kind of power. He was back in his element, on a stage, with a microphone holding court, orchestrating the narrative. He saw the old man's quiet defiance not as the dignity of a man being unjustly ridiculed, but as a direct, insolent challenge to his unassailable authority. This required escalation. He needed to turn this agonizing moment into a display of such overwhelming power and magnanimity, however hollow, that the memory of the dead machine, the public gaffe, would be utterly erased. He would be remembered not as the CEO who failed, but as the benevolent titan of industry who could afford to be playful, even in the throes of a monumental crisis. He would rise from the ashes of his own blunder, grander than before. He raised his hands, a theatrical gesture that quieted the murmuring crowd. A wide, predatory grin, a stark contrast to his earlier mask of fury, spread slowly across his face. "All right," he announced, his voice oozing with a cloying, condescending charm, an oily veneer over his simmering rage. All right, you know what? I like a man with confidence. A man who's not afraid to stare down the future and tell it he knows better." His gaze swept over the audience, inviting them to share in his amusement, his false magnanimity. He walked back towards the inert Titanex, patting its cold, black flank as if it were a prize stallion, a symbol of his power that had, moments ago, betrayed him. "This machine," he said, his voice dropping into a showman's dramatic, almost reverent tone, "represents the pinnacle of human achievement. It's worth more than everything everyone in this room will earn in a decade combined. $5 million of pure, unadulterated genius, a testament to what mankind can achieve when unburdened by the past." He turned back to face Elias, his grin widening, a shark baring its teeth. "Tell you what, Janitor," the word dripped with poison, a calculated insult, a deliberate reminder of the chasm between them. "I'll make you a bet, a once-in-a-lifetime offer, an opportunity to truly touch the future." The hall fell silent again, but this time it was a silence of rapt, hungry attention. This was better than a product launch, more visceral than any corporate announcement. This was a public execution, a carefully orchestrated display of power and cruelty. Every eye, every camera was fixed on the unsuspecting target. "If you," Sterling said, pointing a dramatic finger directly at Elias, ensuring every camera had the shot, every screen broadcast the confrontation, "can walk up on this stage right now, with nothing but what you have in your pockets, and start this machine, which my 60 engineers and quantum processors could not, I'll give it to you." A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, went through the crowd. The sheer audacity, the unbelievable condescension of the offer, hung heavy in the air. Sterling paused for effect, letting the full, preposterous absurdity of the offer sink into the collective consciousness, letting it marinate. "That's right," he boomed, his voice echoing through the vast space. "It's yours, free and clear. A $5 million machine, a monument to a future you couldn't possibly comprehend. You can take it back to your imaginary farm. Plow your imaginary fields with it, old man. A gift from me to you." He spread his arms wide, a gesture of mock generosity that was, in truth, a final, crushing act of humiliation. He was daring the old man to make an utter fool of himself, to solidify his own status as a god casually playing with the lives of mortals. The crowd erupted, not just in laughter this time, but in a chaotic buzz of disbelief and delight, a primal roar of approval. They were witnesses to a legendary act of corporate savagery, a modern-day gladiatorial contest where the outcome was supposedly predetermined. Sterling's eyes, cold and calculating, locked on Elia's, daring him to refuse, which would be an admission of his own powerlessness, a confirmation of his insignificance, or to accept, which would be an invitation to a public and catastrophic humiliation far grander than any insult. To Julian Sterling, it was a perfect, inescapable trap. He had won. He just needed the old man to play his predetermined, pathetic part. He basked in the reflected glow of his imagined triumph, the memory of his recent failure temporarily eclipsed by the promise of this ultimate vindication. He felt a surge of exhilaration, believing himself once more to be the architect of destiny. For a long, agonizing moment, Elia's thorn stood motionless in the unforgiving glare of the spotlight. The roar of the crowd, a tidal wave of judgment, the crushing weight of 1,000 pairs of eyes, the condescending smirk plastered on Julian Sterling's face. It all seemed to wash over him, a turbulent current that left him utterly untouched. He felt the familiar, seductive pull of invisibility, the instinct honed over 2 decades to retreat, to fade back into the comforting embrace of the shadows, and let the world of loud, angry, arrogant men consume itself in its own manufactured drama. It would be easy. A simple shake of the head, a quiet step back into the periphery, and he would be forgotten. A brief, amusing interlude in Julian Sterling's disastrous day. He could return to his life, his silent struggle, his fields, his debt, and his family's failing legacy. The thought offered a fleeting, dangerous comfort. But then his gaze, unwavering and profound, shifted past Sterling, past the manufactured opulence, and settled on the machine itself. The Titanex it sat there, cold and silent, a brilliant mind trapped within a paralyzed body, a testament to forgotten wisdom. He could feel its latent potential, the immense power coiled within its massive engine, a power he knew intimately, profoundly, because a part of him, a sliver of his very soul, was forged into its fundamental core. He saw not a mere collection of circuits and pistons, not a cold algorithm, but a descendant, a prodigal son built by men who, in their relentless pursuit of progress, had forgotten the language of its heart, the visceral truth of its purpose. And in Sterling's smug, ignorant, utterly disconnected face, Elias saw, with piercing clarity, the very reason for that forgetting. The profound arrogance that believed complex code could replace a living soul, that data could supplant dirt. The complex motivation, a quiet, smoldering fire he had banked for 20 long, silent years, stirred deep within him, igniting with a slow, powerful burn. It wasn't about winning a machine, a $5 million trophy to parade around his struggling farm. It wasn't about embarrassing a rich, hollow man, though the satisfaction would be profound. It was about something far deeper, far more sacred. It was about respect. Respect for the land, for the craft, for the enduring wisdom of honest work. It was about proving that technology, for all its dazzling complexity, without a deep, tactile understanding of its true purpose, without reverence for the hands that built it, the earth it was meant to serve, and the human spirit that would operate it, was nothing more than a useless, expensive sculpture, a monument to hubris. It was about the integrity of his legacy, not just his own, but the legacy of every farmer, every mechanic, every man and woman who understood the silent language of the earth. Slowly, deliberately, with a grace born of decades of purposeful movement, Elias leaned the handle of his trash receptacle against the cold concrete pillar. The small, mundane action, stripped of any theatricality, carried an incredible, almost seismic weight. He then reached down, his fingers calloused and strong, and took the damp rag from his side pocket, the one he'd used to clean a coffee spill just minutes earlier, and carefully, meticulously, wiped his hands. The indelible grease under his fingernails remained, a permanent testament to his life's unwavering work, a badge of honor in this sterile, perfumed world. The silence in the room began to change, shifting from amusement to a palpable, tense, nervous energy. The laughter had evaporated, replaced by a collective intake of breath. The joke was supposed to be over. The janitor was supposed to scurry away, retreating into his accustomed invisibility. But he wasn't scurrying. He was moving with a profound, unsettling purpose. Elias took a step forward, out of the comforting shadow of the pillar, and into the full, unforgiving, blinding light of the stage. He looked up at Julian Sterling, his gaze level and clear, utterly devoid of fear or deference. His voice, when it finally came, was not the mumbled acquiescence of a beaten man. It was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried an undeniable, ancient authority that cut through the cavernous hall, silencing the last nervous murmurs, a sound that compelled attention. "I don't need the machine," he said, each word chosen with surgical care, each syllable resonating with unyielding conviction. "But I'll start it for you." Without waiting for a response, without a flicker of doubt, he began to walk. He moved not with a shuffle, not with the hesitant gait of an old man, but with a steady, purposeful stride. A man walking toward his undeniable destiny. He walked past the front row of gaping investors, their faces a tableau of shock and confusion, past the security guards who seemed unsure whether to stop this unassuming figure who had so thoroughly disrupted their carefully controlled event, and toward the short, black set of stairs leading to the stage. With every measured step, the silence deepened, the tension tightening like a wire pulled to its absolute breaking point. The world was holding its breath, collectively sensing that something profound, something irreversible, was about to unfold. The invisible man was walking onto the stage, not as a janitor, but as a silent, formidable force. The moment Elias' worn work boots touched the polished black surface of the stage, the atmosphere became electric, charged with an almost palpable energy. The huddle of panicked engineers, clustered around their inert technological marvel, parted for him as if by an unseen, undeniable force, their expressions a confused mixture of professional contempt and growing, unsettling unease. They clutched their diagnostic tablets, devices that were screaming 1,000 data points of unhelpful information, none of which pointed to the simple, mechanical truth Elias already held. To them, Elias Thorne was an anomaly, an unwelcome variable their algorithms simply couldn't account for, a ghost from a past they believed they had eradicated. He paid them no mind, his focus absolute, his path unerring. He walked past the glowing red button that had so spectacularly failed Julian Sterling, ignoring the sleek touchscreen interface that controlled the machine's higher, more complex functions. His gaze, his very being, was drawn to the heart of the matter. He headed straight for the engine compartment, his steps sure and steady, the movements of a man returning to a familiar, beloved place. Sterling, momentarily stunned by the breathtaking audacity of the turn of events, quickly recovered, a smirk, a thin, cruel line returning to his face. This was even better than he had hoped. The old man was actually going through with it. The humiliation, when it came, would be absolute, unforgettable. Elias stopped beside the massive engine block, which was partially shielded by a lightweight composite panel, held in place by a series of magnetic latches. He didn't try to pry it off with brute force, nor did he search for a hidden release. Instead, with a quiet reverence that astonished the onlookers, he simply placed the palm of his right hand flat against the cold, unyielding surface. He closed his eyes, shutting out the glaring lights, the staring faces, the entire manufactured reality of the convention center. The crowd watched, mesmerized, a collective murmur rising and falling. What was he doing? Praying? Was he trying to use some arcane, forgotten form of magic? Trying to use the Force, as some cynical tech journalists were already typing furiously into their tablets, composing the snarky headlines that would surely follow. But Elias wasn't praying. He was listening. Not with his ears, which were adept at discerning the subtle nuances of an engine's song, but with his hand, with the bones in his arm, with the deep, ingrained wisdom of a lifetime's experience that had trained his every sense to perceive the secret, subtle language of machines. He could feel the faint, almost imperceptible tension in the cold metal, the subtle, abnormal pressure differential in the labyrinth of pipes and wires beneath his palm. It was a language the sensors, for all their billion-dollar sophistication, could not speak, for they were programmed to look for grand, catastrophic failures, for broken code, for fried circuits and melted components. They were blind to a problem of simple physics, a mechanical oversight so fundamental, so utterly basic, that it was beneath their digital notice, too simple for their complex algorithms to even consider. He remembered, with startling clarity, the genesis of this understanding. Decades ago, fresh from the rural Nebraska farm, a self-taught prodigy with grease under his fingernails and fire in his belly, he had designed the original Vanguard V12. He had built it for farmers like his father, men who lived by the sun and the soil, who needed a machine that could be fixed in a muddy field with nothing more than a wrench, some intuition and common sense. He had poured his soul into that engine, incorporating manual overrides, mechanical fail-safes for every automated system, redundancies that defied the elegant designs favored by the corporations. He knew that the land, the weather, and the sheer unpredictability of farming life demanded practicality, not just theoretical perfection. His design had been revolutionary, a testament to efficiency and durability, a work of art born of necessity. He had sold the patent for a modest sum, enough to save the family farm for a time, believing his genius would serve a noble purpose. But then, the corporations, Sterling Dynamics among them, had taken his design, stripped it of its soul, buried its mechanical brilliance under layers of code and marketing jargon, twisting his creation into a symbol of their own greed. Repulsed by the betrayal of his vision, by the corporate politics and the insatiable hunger for profit that divorced technology from its true purpose, he had walked away, disappearing into self-imposed exile, leaving behind the noise and the schematics, retreating to the quiet solace of his land, his silent struggle. He opened his eyes. He knew. The answer was clear, undeniable, a truth felt in his bones. Without a word, without breaking his profound focus, he reached into the right pocket of his faded coveralls. The crowd leaned forward, a collective intake of breath, expecting what? A multi-tool of impossible sophistication, a hidden diagnostic key of unfathomable power. Elia's hand emerged holding a small, simple wrench. It was not a piece of high-tech equipment. It was old, the metal pitted with the honorable rust of honest labor in places, the grip worn smooth from years of use, from countless hours spent in the silent, symbiotic dance between man and machine. It looked like something you'd find at the bottom of a forgotten toolbox in a dusty barn, an artifact from a bygone era. The contrast was breathtaking, almost painful. The $5 million symbol of a sterile, digitally controlled future, about to be touched by a $5 relic of the visceral, analog past. The gasp that rippled through the audience was one of confused awe, a realization dawning on some, a dawning horror on others. He didn't use the wrench to pry or force anything, to inflict violence upon the machine. His touch was gentle, precise. He located a small, almost invisible seam along the bottom edge of the composite panel, a whisper of a line in the otherwise monolithic design. He inserted the flat end of the wrench, not as a lever, but as a key, a specific knowing insertion. With a gentle, practiced twist, a movement born of intimate familiarity, he disengaged an internal manual latch, a feature he himself had insisted on in a design blueprint 30 years ago, a crucial failsafe for precisely when the smart systems inevitably failed. The magnetic locks released with a soft, almost inaudible click, a sigh of mechanical surrender, and the panel swung open silently, gracefully, revealing the gleaming, complex, vibrant heart of the Titanex. It was a moment of profound revelation, of the old world reclaiming its forgotten wisdom. With the engine compartment exposed, a collective gasp rippled through the audience, a sound of profound awe mixed with burgeoning comprehension. The internal workings of the Titanex were a marvel of engineering, a tightly packed universe of chrome pipes, braided hoses, and wiring harnesses woven together with surgical precision. It was immaculate, sterile, and utterly intimidating, a cold, gleaming sculpture of complexity. Sterling's engineers, who had been trying to diagnose the problem through a firewalled, abstract operating system, stared at the exposed engine as if seeing it for the very first time, their faces a mixture of professional shame and dawning, uncomfortable reverence. They had been blind, utterly blind, to the physical reality of their own creation. Elias ignored them all, their frantic whispers, their useless tablets. His focus was absolute, a laser-like intensity that seemed to draw all the ambient energy of the room into itself. He leaned into the compartment, his movements economical and precise, devoid of any wasted motion. He wasn't searching, groping blindly in a tangle of wires. He was going to a specific location, like a man returning to a familiar room in his own house, guided by an internal map. His hand, guided by decades of muscle memory and an almost mystical feel for machinery, bypassed the primary fuel injection rail, slipped past the quantum processing unit's cooling system, past the myriad of dazzling, complex components, and found its way deep into the machine's gut, to a place no diagnostic sensor was designed to monitor, a blind spot in the digital matrix. His gnarled fingers found it immediately, a small, unassuming brass valve. It was a manual fuel pressure regulator, a legacy component from an older, simpler design philosophy, a whisper of the Vanguard V12's original genius. In the Titanex's fully automated, supposedly self-correcting system, it was intended to be locked permanently in an open position, rendered obsolete by a dozen redundant electronic solenoids and 1,000 lines of predictive code. But it wasn't open. It was closed. Not all the way, but just enough to starve the engine of the precise priming pressure needed for ignition, a microscopic blockage in a torrent of data. The digital sensors, for all their supposed intelligence, read the fuel tanks as full and the lines as pressurized. But they couldn't detect this simple mechanical blockage, this analog choke point. The system was too smart to look for a stupid problem, too sophisticated to consider basic physical malfunction. It was a perfect, damning symbol of modern engineering's hubris. Elias knew this valve existed because he had put it there, in spirit if not in person. It was a direct descendant of a feature from his own masterpiece, the Vanguard V12, an engine block so reliable, so utterly dependable, It had become the industry standard for 3 decades. The Vanguard was designed to be fixed in a muddy field with a wrench and common sense, in the unforgiving heart of a Nebraska winter. He had built in manual overrides for every automated system, redundancies born of bitter experience, anticipating the inevitable failures of over-reliance on technology. The designers of the Titanex, in their blinding hubris, had kept the core block, because nothing they designed could match its raw efficiency, its proven durability. But they had buried its soul under layers of code, treated its mechanical genius as a quaint, unnecessary foundation, a vestigial organ in their new digital god. He leaned closer, his weathered face just inches from the cold, gleaming engine block, his breath fogging slightly on the metal. The crowd saw an old man mumbling to himself, perhaps a final, desperate prayer. Julian Sterling, his face a contorted mask of bewilderment and rising dread, saw a crazy person performing his last rites before total, public humiliation. But Elias was speaking to the machine itself, a whispered communion between creator and creation, an intimate act of restoration. "There now," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly hum that was felt more than heard, resonating deep within the steel chassis. "Just thirsty is all, been starved for too long. Let's get you a drink, old friend." It was a quiet act of personification, a mark of profound respect, not just for the dormant power within the steel, but for the fundamental truth of its existence. He fit the small, rusted wrench onto the nut of the valve. It was a perfect fit, a click of ancient familiarity. He gave it a deliberate, gentle quarter turn to the left. There was a soft, satisfying asterisk hiss asterisk, almost imperceptible to the uninitiated, as the trapped pressure was released and fuel, now unimpeded, flooded the injectors with a hungry rush. The sound was barely audible to anyone more than 3 feet away, lost in the vastness of the hall, but to Elias it was a profound sigh of relief, the machine itself drawing a deep, life-giving breath. He withdrew his hand and the wrench, placing the humble tool back into his pocket, his work, for this critical moment, complete. He then reached for the one thing the engineers, blinded by their digital readouts and panicked algorithms, had utterly overlooked in their frantic search for a complex solution: the manual ignition override. It wasn't a button on a sleek, luminous interface. It was a simple, rugged toggle switch, deliberately hidden behind a small safety plate, another ghost of the Vanguard's design, another testament to Elias' foresight. It was a physical key to a mechanical heart, waiting patiently to be found by someone who truly understood. He flipped up the safety plate with his thumb, a small, decisive gesture, and engaged the switch. The world held its breath, poised on the precipice of revelation. For a heartbeat, there was only the crisp, solid sound of the toggle switch's mechanical click, a sound that cut through the profound silence with shocking finality. Then the world exploded in noise. The Titanex's engine didn't just start, it detonated to life. It wasn't the polite, synthesized hum of an electric vehicle, the gentle whir of a silent digital future. It was the deep, concussive roar of 12 massive cylinders firing in perfect, earth-shattering unison, a primal scream of unleashed power. A percussive blast of sound erupted from the stage, a physical force that hit the audience in the chest, rattling their teeth and shaking the very foundations of the convention hall. It was the sound of $5 million of dormant power being unleashed in an instant, a visceral, untamed energy that drowned out every other sound in the universe, asserting its undeniable presence. It was the sound of life, raw and magnificent, bursting forth from the cold steel. The crowd, which had been leaning forward in gleeful anticipation of yet another layer of failure, was thrown back in their seats by the sheer sonic violence of it. Gasps turned into cries of shock, then to expressions of profound, disbelieving awe. People instinctively covered their ears, their faces a mixture of terror and exhilaration. On stage, the huddle of engineers stumbled back, their faces white with disbelief, their carefully constructed worldviews shattering around them. The diagnostic tablets some of them were still holding flickered and died, their delicate circuits overwhelmed by the massive electromagnetic field generated by the engine's thunderous ignition, rendered useless by the sheer, analog power. Julian Sterling was frozen solid, a statue of petrified arrogance. The smug, condescending smirk that had been his constant companion was gone, vaporized by the sonic blast. His mouth hung open, his perfectly tanned face slack with a mixture of terror, utter incomprehension, and a dawning, sickening dread. The roar was not just the sound of an engine starting. It was the sound of his entire, carefully constructed worldview collapsing around him, a cacophony of shattered illusions. It was the sound of his carefully coded, digitally controlled future being savagely ripped apart by a ghost from the analog past, by a wisdom he had long scorned. He stared at the old man, who stood calmly beside the roaring beast, his hand resting gently on the vibrating chassis, as if calming a wild animal he had just woken from a long slumber. Elias Thorne wasn't even flinching. He was home. The engine settled from its initial explosive roar into a low, rumbling idle. It was a sound of immense, effortless power, each piston stroke a perfectly tuned beat in a symphony of controlled combustion. It was a sound of life, of purpose, of enduring, undeniable strength. And it was a sound that one man in the front row, a figure of legendary stature in the agricultural machinery world, recognized not merely by its volume, but by its distinct character, its resonant soul. Marcus Vance, a legendary investor and one of the most respected figures in the agricultural machinery world, slowly, deliberately, got to his feet. He was an old man himself, with eyes that had seen a half-century of booms and busts, of innovations and failures. He had been one of the first to invest in a radical new engine design back in the 1980s, a design that had revolutionized the industry. He stared at the stage, not at the gleaming Titanex, but at the farmhand's hands resting gently on the engine, the way he had held that rusted wrench, the quiet confidence of his movements. It was all hauntingly, undeniably familiar. His gaze sharpened, a spark of ancient memory igniting in his eyes. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his voice, though not amplified by a microphone, cutting through the stunned silence that followed the roar with an unexpected, profound clarity. "Those hands," Vance said, his voice trembling slightly with dawning recognition, with the weight of decades. "I know those hands. They belong to a legend." The investor's words, though not amplified, seemed to carry a strange, almost mystical power in the suddenly quiet hall. The engine's deep, resonant idle provided a dramatic, low underscoring to his statement, a steady beat beneath the unfolding drama. All eyes, including the live-feed cameras, swiveled from Elias to Marcus Vance, sensing a new, pivotal turn in the narrative. Julian Sterling, still paralyzed on the other side of the stage, looked at Vance with a confused, pleading expression, as if hoping the old investor could somehow explain the inexplicable witchcraft that had just occurred, could somehow reframe this utter disaster. "That's not a janitor," Vance continued, his voice growing stronger, gaining an undeniable authority, filled with a certainty that commanded immediate attention. He took another step closer to the stage, pointing just as Sterling had done moments before, but his gesture was one of reverence, not scorn, a profound act of recognition. "Look at him, that's Elias Thorne, the real genius behind the revolution." The name, Elias Thorne, meant nothing to the younger tech journalists. to the hungry Silicon Valley venture capitalists who chased only the next big IPO, but to the older generation, to the men and women who had built their fortunes not on ephemeral code, but on the enduring strength of steel and diesel. The name landed like a thunderclap, an explosive revelation. A frantic whispering erupted in the front rows, spreading backward through the crowd like fire through dry grass, as the legend, long thought lost to time, was resurrected. Thorne, the Elias Thorne, the man who built the Vanguard engine, the very heart of modern agriculture. I thought he was dead, a forgotten relic. No, they said he just vanished, walked away from it all 30 years ago, disgusted with the machine he had created. The story, a legend in the agrotech world, a myth whispered in engine shops and boardrooms, was being resurrected right before their very eyes. Elias Thorne, the reclusive, self-taught genius from the Nebraska plains. The man who, in a small, unassuming barn, fueled by nothing but an insatiable curiosity and an innate understanding of physics, had designed and built the Vanguard V12, an engine so perfectly balanced, so impossibly efficient, and so utterly indestructible that it had become the gold standard, the very heart of the agricultural revolution of the late 20th century. He had sold the patent for a modest sum, enough to save his family farm from the creeping tendrils of debt, refusing to join the burgeoning corporation that was built directly on the bedrock of his genius. And then, at the absolute height of his fame, repulsed by the corporate greed, the boardroom politics, the endless pursuit of profit that had twisted his beautiful, practical creation into a mere commodity, he had disappeared completely, vanishing without a trace into self-imposed obscurity. He wasn't a janitor. He was royalty, a king in coveralls. He was the ghost in the machine, and he had returned. The profound realization swept through the hall, a seismic wave of understanding, fundamentally reframing everything that had just happened. The mockery, the absurd bet, the humble, rusted wrench, the whispered communion, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity for Sterling, with dawning awe for the rest. This wasn't a lucky guess, a random fluke. It was an act of profound, intimate knowledge, an undeniable assertion of mastery. He hadn't just fixed the machine, he had communed with it, breathed life back into its neglected soul. He knew its deepest secrets because he had written its foundational language, crafted its very essence. The engineers on stage, their faces still pale, stared at Elias with a new emotion. Awe. The man they had dismissed as a senile old fool, an irrelevant artifact, was the architect of the very technology they had failed to understand, the craftsman of the heart they could not find. They were mere mechanics following instructions. He was the composer, the silent maestro. The shift in the room's power dynamic was seismic, instantaneous. Julian Sterling, the self-proclaimed visionary, the architect of the future, was now exposed as a fraud, a hollow man who had built his entire empire on a foundation he didn't even recognize, a genius he had publicly scorned. He finally snapped out of his trance, the crushing implications of the revelation crashing down on him like a collapsing building. The ridicule he had inflicted, the public bet, the arrogant offer of his $5 million machine to the man who was, in essence, its very creator, its soul. The humiliation was absolute, irreversible, an indelible stain on his meticulously crafted image. He had to fix it. He had to reclaim control, or everything he had built would crumble into dust. The weight of financial ruin, of utter social ostracism, pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had to pivot, to spin, to somehow save himself. Sterling's mind, which had been frozen in a state of primal shock, rebooted with the cold, desperate logic of self-preservation. The narrative, his narrative, had been utterly stolen from him, ripped from his grasping hands. He was no longer the protagonist of this grand story. He was the fool, the jester in his own tragedy. He had to rewrite the ending, and he had to do it now, before the last vestiges of his reputation evaporated into the frigid convention center air. He plastered a smile on his face, a grotesque, terrified thing that didn't reach his eyes, a rictus of pure desperation, and began to walk briskly toward Elias, his hands outstretched in a desperate, pathetic gesture of welcome, of feigned camaraderie. "Mr. Thorne," he exclaimed, his voice artificially warm and booming, a pathetic, transparent attempt to recapture his earlier showmanship, to project an illusion of control. "Elias, my goodness, I had absolutely no idea. What an honor, an absolute unimaginable honor." He reached Elias and tried to clap him on the shoulder, a forced display of intimacy, but Elias shifted slightly, imperceptibly, and Sterling's hand slapped awkwardly against the empty air, a silent, pointed rejection. Undeterred, Sterling barreled on, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic torrent, a desperate cascade of sycophantic drivel. "This is incredible. Ladies and gentlemen, are you seeing this? A living legend right here among us. Elias Thorne." He gestured wildly to the crowd as if this had been his plan all along, a meticulously orchestrated surprise celebrity guest to consecrate his new, supposedly revolutionary machine. Of course you could start it. How could I have been so blind? The spirit of your genius lives within the Titanex. It was simply waiting for its father to come and wake it up, to give it life, to unlock its true potential. The sycophantic drivel was so thick, so cloying. It was almost suffocating, an assault on the senses. The crowd watched in stunned, disgusted silence. They had witnessed the mockery, the unadulterated scorn. They had heard the word janitor hurled like a stone. This clumsy, transparent attempt to spin the disaster, to transform humiliation into a triumphant reunion, was more pathetic, more nauseating than the failure itself. It was a final, desperate indignity. "The machine, of course, is yours," Sterling continued, his voice cracking slightly with the raw strain of his performance, the fear bubbling just beneath the surface. "A promise is a promise, etched in stone. A small token of our immense esteem for the man who started it all, who gave birth to this lineage of innovation. Consider it a gift. No, consider it an inheritance. The greatest legacy one man could pass to another." He was not just giving away the $5 million machine. He was frantically trying to buy back his shattered dignity, to purchase a moment of grace. He was attempting to turn a humiliating, public defeat into a mere transaction, to reduce Elias' profound act of knowledge, his spiritual triumph, to a simple exchange of goods. If Elias accepted the machine, he would, in essence, become a participant in Sterling's lie, a partner in the shameful cover-up. He would become complicit. "And that's not all," Sterling forged ahead, growing more desperate, his eyes wide, manic with pleading hope. We need you, Elias. Sterling Dynamics needs you now more than ever. I want you to join our board of directors to guide us into this new era. As Chief Innovation Consultant, name your price. Whatever it is, you'll have it, every single dollar. We need your experience, your wisdom, your soul." He had finally said the word, soul. But coming from his lips, from a man so devoid of genuine connection, it was just another commodity, another line item on a balance sheet, another resource to be extracted and exploited. He was trying to purchase the very thing he had proven, unequivocally, he didn't understand, couldn't comprehend. He looked at Elias, his eyes wide with a manic, pleading hope, bordering on frantic despair. He was offering him everything: unimaginable wealth, unassailable status, undeniable power within his crumbling empire. All Elias had to do was play along, accept the gilded cage and save him. To save Julian Sterling, the man who had mocked and diminished him, to become another cog in the very machine he had rejected decades ago. The ultimate test of his principles, a final, agonizing temptation. Elia's thorn stood beside the rumbling heart of the Titanex, a silent, unmoving island in the violent storm of Julian Sterling's desperation. He had listened to the man's frantic, groveling speech, his pitiful, transparent offers, without a flicker of emotion on his weathered face, his gaze unwavering, clear as a mountain spring. He looked at Sterling's outstretched, trembling hand, at the raw, undisguised pleading in his eyes, and he saw not an offer of partnership, not a genuine olive branch, but the final, desperate gambit of a hollow man, clinging to the last vestiges of his power. Sterling wasn't offering him a seat at a table of equals. He was offering him a gilded cage, a comfortable prison, a role as a token relic to legitimize a bankrupt philosophy. To accept would be to betray every principle he had ever lived by, every truth he had unearthed in his long, quiet exile. Slowly, deliberately, with the same quiet grace and profound intention he had shown all along, Elias raised his hand, not to shake Sterling's, not to accept the false peace, but to the control panel, to the very nexus of the machine's power. With surgical precision, he located the engine kill switch, a simple, unassuming button, yet now imbued with immense symbolic power. He flipped it. The thunderous, resonant idol of the Titanex died instantly, abruptly, plunging the stage and the entire convention hall into a sudden, shocking, absolute silence. The absence of the roar, the sudden void where powerful sound had been, was even more powerful, more resonant than its presence. It was a definitive, final statement, a declarative act of will. The life he had so effortlessly given the machine, he had just as easily, just as decisively taken away. He was in control not just of the machine, but of the moment, of the narrative, of the very essence of power. He then turned his full, unblinking attention to Julian Sterling. For the first time, he truly looked at the man, his gaze piercing through the expensive designer shirt, the faded spray tan, the crumbling facade of confidence, seeing the terrified, empty core within. His gaze was not angry, not vengeful, but profoundly diagnostic, like a physician delivering a terminal prognosis. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, not a booming pronouncement, but it held the immense, unyielding gravity of undisputed truth, echoing in the vast, suddenly silent hall. "I don't want your machine," he said simply, each word a stone dropped into a still, deep well. The words hung in the air, a stunning, almost incomprehensible rejection of a $5 million prize, a staggering repudiation of everything Sterling held dear. Sterling's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He couldn't comprehend it. His mind, trained only in the calculus of profit and loss, could not process such a profound act of self-denial. Why would anyone turn down that kind of money, that kind of power? It was alien to his very being. Elias continued, his voice resonating with the unwavering conviction of a lifetime spent in honest communion with the earth and its tools. "It has no soul." He gestured vaguely at the dead, silent machine, a metallic tombstone to a misguided vision. "You've given it a brain, 1,000 lines of code, but you forgot to give it a heart. It has 1,000 sensors to tell it the moisture content of the soil with surgical precision, but it doesn't know the feel of the earth when it's about to rain, the subtle whisper of change. It can analyze the chlorophyll content of 1,000,000 stalks of corn, but it doesn't know the difference between wheat that's truly ready for harvest and wheat that needs another day of sun, another breath of wind." He took a small, deliberate step closer to Sterling, and the CEO, stripped bare of his arrogance, instinctively recoiled. a primal flinch of a cornered animal sensing an undeniable threat. "You build machines for men like you," Elias said, his voice dropping lower, imbued with a quiet, devastating finality. "Men who sit in clean rooms and look at spreadsheets, who parse data and manipulate markets. You've forgotten that these are tools for people who live by the seasons, who feel the grit of the soil under their fingernails, the ache in their backs, the taste of rain on their lips. You don't respect the land, you don't respect the rhythm of nature, and you certainly don't respect the operator, the man or woman who pours their life into feeding the world. And a machine without respect, without that fundamental connection to its purpose, is just metal. It is hollow, a lifeless husk." He had passed judgment, not with anger, but with the quiet, devastating clarity of absolute truth. It wasn't an angry tirade. It was a quiet, profound diagnosis of a terminal illness. The illness of disconnection, of spiritual poverty. He had laid bare Sterling's entire philosophy, exposing it as utterly, irrevocably bankrupt. Without another word, without a backward glance, Elias Thorne turned his back on Julian Sterling, on the magnificent, dead tightnecks, and on the fortune he had just been offered, a fortune that held no meaning for him. He walked to the edge of the stage, his shoulders straight, his stride as steady and purposeful as it had been on his way up. He did not look back. He had done what he came to do. He had spoken the truth, the fundamental, visceral truth. He had defended the soul of his craft, the integrity of his legacy, and the silent wisdom of the land. The prize was irrelevant. The moral victory was absolute, etched into the very fabric of the moment. He had restored dignity where it had been scorned, and in doing so had found his own. As Elias descended the stage stairs, a strange, transformative thing happened. The spell that had held the audience captive, a mix of corporate greed and morbid curiosity, broke with a collective shudder. They were no longer passive spectators at a corporate drama, a gladiatorial show designed for entertainment. They were participants, witnesses to a moment of genuine, unscripted truth, a raw, undeniable authenticity. And in that moment, in that profound shift, they chose a side. Marcus Vance, the old investor, the first to recognize the legend, was the first to move. He walked past the front row, ignoring the bewildered security guards who now seemed utterly superfluous, and met Elias at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply extended his hand, palm open, a gesture of profound respect. Elias took it, and the two old men, titans of different worlds, one of finance, one of the earth, shared a firm, understanding handshake, a silent pact of shared wisdom. It was a moment that resonated with the weight of decades, of truths spoken and unspoken. Then, another investor, a formidable woman who managed a multi-billion-dollar agricultural fund, her eyes now gleaming with a new kind of insight, followed Vance's lead. Then another and another and another. They began to swarm Elias, not with the frantic, aggressive energy of paparazzi, but with the quiet, urgent deference of pilgrims seeking an audience with a sage, a true master. They didn't want to talk about the tightnecks, about its failed launch or its potential for profit. They wanted to talk to the man who understood its heart, the man who spoke the language of the land. They were ignoring the product, the dazzling, broken commodity, and following the creator, the source of genuine value. The gravitational pull of Sterling's stage, moments ago so absolute, had shifted. "Mr. Thorne, could I have a moment of your time? Elias, I'd love to talk to you about a new project, something truly groundbreaking, something with a soul. Sir, what you did up there, it was truly inspiring, a revelation." Elias, looking slightly overwhelmed by the sudden, intense attention, the unexpected shift in the world's perception of him, simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of their newfound respect. He kept walking, a moving center of a new kind of gravity, slowly, inexorably pulling the real power in the room, the true visionaries, away with him. He walked back toward the pillar where his trash receptacle stood waiting, a humble throne for a king in coveralls, a silent testament to his enduring humility. On stage, Julian Sterling was left utterly, devastatingly alone. He stood beside his silent, $5 million tombstone, a relic of a future that had died before it was ever truly born. The spotlight still blazed down on him, but now they felt accusatory, merciless, exposing his isolation, his profound emptiness. The live feed cameras, which had so eagerly followed Elias and his new, rapidly growing entourage of genuine influence, now cruelly swung back to Sterling, zooming in on his pale, sweat-sheened face, his trembling hands. He was an emperor with no clothes, a king with no subjects, stripped bare of his illusions and his power. The running machine he didn't understand was silent. The man he had humiliated, the man he had believed to be nothing, had walked away with his dignity, his reputation, and most crucially, his investors. Julian Sterling was left with nothing but an expensive piece of metal and the deafening, crushing silence of his own spectacular, self-inflicted failure. The world had moved on, leaving him behind in the wreckage of his arrogance. The chasm between him and Elias Thorne was not just financial or social, it was existential. The Nevada sun, a pale, indifferent smear in the vast, unforgiving sky, cast long, distorted shadows as Elias Thorne drove his 20-year-old pickup truck out of Las Vegas. The glittering mirage of the city, its promises as hollow as Julian Sterling's words, slowly vanished in his rearview mirror. He didn't stop, didn't look back, until the last shimmering skyscraper had dissolved into the heat haze and the landscape had resolved into the honest, rugged expanse of the desert, a silent prelude to the familiar plains of Nebraska. The drive back to his farm was long, arduous, but the miles unspooled beneath his tires with a quiet, satisfying rhythm, each turn of the wheel a testament to hard-won freedom. He had gone to the expo for a temp job, a necessary humiliation, a meager way to make a few $100s to patch a persistent leak in his old barn roof, to keep the wolf of debt just a little further from his family's century-old legacy. He left having reminded the world, and perhaps, more importantly, having reminded himself of who he truly was, of the enduring power of genuine knowledge and an unyielding soul. Weeks bled into a quiet month, the relentless pace of nature replacing the frenetic energy of the convention center. The world of Sterling dynamics and the spectacular failure of the Titanex felt as distant as a half-forgotten dream, a fleeting, insignificant blur in the grand tapestry of his life. Elias' life returned to its familiar, comforting cadence. The pre-dawn chill, the rich, earthy smell of coffee and diesel fuel mingling in the morning air, the satisfying ache in his muscles after a long day of honest, purposeful work. He fixed the barn roof, hammering each nail with a quiet, resolute precision. He recalibrated the engine on his old, faithful tractor, a machine with a Vanguard V12 heart, of course, humming with the very essence of his genius, until it purred like a contented cat, a symphony of controlled power. He sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the vast, silent horizon of his fields, a quiet man content in his quiet kingdom, his spirit renewed. The news sometimes flickered on the small television in his living room, reports of Sterling Dynamics stock plummeting over 30% in the wake of the Titanex debacle. Analysts spoke of a catastrophic loss of investor confidence, of boardrooms in chaos, of a visionary dethroned. It was all just noise to him, the distant echoes of a battle he had long since won. His victory was not measured in stock prices, but in the quiet strength of his conviction the enduring legacy of his family farm, now a little less threatened. One late afternoon, as the shadows lengthened across the prairie, a cloud of dust appeared on the long gravel road leading to his farmhouse, an anomaly disturbing the quiet peace. It was a sleek, black European sedan, a car so utterly out of place in this landscape of pickups and tractors it might as well have been a spaceship, a stark symbol of a world that refused to let go. It pulled to a silent stop near the porch, and Julian Sterling, a ghost of his former self, emerged. He was dressed not in a sharp, tailored suit, but in expensive, ill-fitting jeans and a designer shirt, a pathetic, transparent attempt to look like he belonged, to mimic the very authenticity he scorned. He looked thinner, gaunt, his spray tan faded to a sickly pallor, the arrogant, predatory fire in his eyes reduced to a dim, desperate ember. The weight of his colossal failure, of financial ruin and social ostracism, had finally broken him. He walked up to the porch where Elias was sitting, rocking gently in his chair, a glass of lemonade in his hand, a silent, unmoving presence. Sterling held a slim, expensive briefcase, its leather gleaming faintly. "Thorn," he said, his voice stripped of its former booming arrogance, now quiet, almost hoarse, carrying the raw rasp of defeat. Elias didn't get up. He just rocked gently in his chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip of lemonade, letting the silence stretch, forcing Sterling to confront his own profound discomfort. Sterling. The name from Elias' lips was a simple acknowledgement, devoid of triumph or malice, merely a statement of fact. "I came to understand," Sterling said, his gaze sweeping over the simple, well-kept farm, the old but perfectly maintained equipment, the unassuming beauty of a life lived authentically. He seemed to search for answers in the weathered wood, the rich soil. "The board fired me. The company is being restructured, gutted from the inside. I lost everything. My fortune, my reputation, my empire." His voice was tinged with a raw, desperate bewilderment, the incomprehension of a man whose entire foundation had crumbled beneath him. "You didn't have much to lose," Elias replied, his voice flat, not cruel, just brutally, profoundly honest, cutting through Sterling's self-pity. Sterling flinched, a visceral reaction to the truth. He opened the briefcase. It was filled with cash, neatly stacked bundles of crisp $100 bills, $1 million, a fraction of his former wealth. "This is all I have left," he said, his voice thin, reedy. $1 million. I'm not offering you a job. I'm not trying to buy your loyalty, your silence. I want to buy the knowledge. Teach me. Teach me what you know, Elias. I need to understand why I failed, why it all came to nothing." He was offering his last vestiges of material wealth for a wisdom he could not grasp. Elias stopped rocking. He looked at the money, then back at Sterling's haunted, desperate face, at the visible torment in his eyes. He finally stood up, slowly, deliberately, and walked to the edge of the porch, his movements imbued with a quiet power. He pointed to his old tractor, gleaming faithfully in the late afternoon sun, its Vanguard V12 engine a testament to enduring genius. "You see that machine?" Elias asked, his voice low, a quiet challenge. "It's obsolete," Sterling said automatically, a reflex born of his old, broken worldview, even now unable to fully shed his ingrained arrogance. "That engine has 40,000 operational hours on it, serving this land, year in and year out. Your Titanex couldn't manage 40 seconds. Do you know why?" Elias' eyes, ancient and wise, bore into Sterling's, demanding a truth beyond data. Sterling just shook his head, looking like a lost, confused child stripped of all pretense. The complex algorithms of his mind offered no answers here. Elias bent down, picked up a handful of dark, rich soil from a nearby flower bed, the very earth that sustained his life and his legacy, and let it run slowly, sensuously, through his gnarled, soil-stained fingers. "You failed because you think this," he said, gesturing to the soil, to the very essence of life, "is merely data, a problem to be solved by an algorithm, by a cold, disconnected calculation. You think power comes from a boardroom, from a line of code, from manipulating numbers on a screen." He looked Sterling dead in the eye, his voice as quiet and unyielding as the bedrock beneath their feet, resonating with the immovable truth of the land. "Power isn't in that briefcase, Julian, it's in this." He held up his empty, soil-stained hands, scarred by a lifetime of labor, hands that had communed with the earth, with the machines that served it. "It's in knowing that a machine has to serve the earth, not the other way around. It's in the grit, the sweat, the intuition. It's a truth you can't buy, Julian, and one I can't teach you. You have to live it. You have to feel it in your very bones." He turned and walked back to his chair, leaving Sterling standing there, alone on the gravel path, with his briefcase full of useless paper, a fortune that held no power here. The symmetrical catharsis was complete, profound, and absolute. It wasn't a loud victory, but a quiet, crushing one, far more devastating than any public shaming. Sterling hadn't just lost his company. He had been shown the absolute poverty of his own soul, the gaping void where genuine connection should have been. He closed the briefcase, the soft click echoing in the vast, indifferent prairie silence, and walked back to his car, a man utterly and finally defeated, not by a rival's superior strategy, but by a truth he could never comprehend, a wisdom he had always scorned. Elias sat back down, took another slow sip of lemonade, and watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a silent, enduring promise of another day. And so their destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old, not of corporate empires, but of enduring truth and respect for the earth. Their story now belongs to time, but its power only grows if shared. The greatest triumph is not in proving others wrong, but in remaining true to the soul of your own work, in honoring the whispers of the land. But as one man breaks the system, another is forever trapped by it, ensnared in its relentless, unforgiving gears. What happens when the only way to save your own legacy is to partner with the very enemy who seeks to destroy it, to compromise with the darkness you once fought? If this journey marked your soul, leave a like and subscribe. For the best stories are those that refuse to die in silence, echoing through the ages.